When the HOA tried to bulldoze my family's land for their luxury resort, they had no idea I'd spent months laying the perfect trap. They took my bait, hook, line, and sinker, but how did I turn their own greed into the sweetest victory our neighborhood had ever seen? The paper cut from the official HOA letter stung my finger as I stood at my mailbox, but what hurt more were the words inside. Asterisk, after review of community boundaries, your back acre has been reclassified as common property. Asterisk, I read it twice, my hands shaking. This land had been in my family for 3 generations. I marched straight to Eleanor Winter's house, our new HOA president, with her perfect garden and even more perfect smile. She answered the door in workout clothes, not even trying to hide her annoyance. Can I help you, David? This letter says you're taking my land. There must be some mistake, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Eleanor's smile didn't reach her eyes. No mistake. Our professional survey shows your grandfather's hand-drawn maps were incorrect. The board voted unanimously last night. Without telling me, I'd been paying taxes on that land for 15 years. She examined her manicured nails. The HOA bylaws don't require notification for property corrections. We're planning a wonderful resort-style pool there. Everyone will benefit, even you. I was about to argue when music exploded from next door. The Morgan's yard. Eleanor's smile turned genuine. I should go. Tyler and Samantha are hosting the neighborhood welcome party. You should come, it might help you adjust to the changes. Walking home, the music grew louder. Through the fence, I could see my neighbors laughing by their brand new pool, built suspiciously close to our property line. That night, I couldn't sleep. The bass thumped until 1 a.m. I tried calling Tyler twice, no answer. At 1:15, I knocked on their door. Tyler answered, red-faced and holding a beer. Hey man, party's over. What's up? It's almost 1:30. Some of us work tomorrow. Samantha appeared behind him. We stopped the music right at 1. Check the bylaws. Tyler cut me off. The noise limit's still okay. Speaking of Eleanor, did they know about this HOA plan for my back acre? Their guilty looks told me everything. You did know. You knew they were stealing my land. Not stealing, Samantha corrected. Reallocating. The resort will have a lap pool for serious swimmers, cabanas, a cocktail bar. On my property. Tyler shrugged. It's not personal. Eleanor showed us the real property lines. Your grandfather's maps were wrong. Back home, I couldn't sleep. I dug out Grandpa's old wooden chest from the attic. Inside were the original property documents, yellowed with age. I spread them on the kitchen table under the lamp, comparing them to the modern survey Eleanor had attached to her letter. Something wasn't right. Grandpa's boundaries followed natural landmarks: the creek, the old oak tree, the rocky ridge. The HOA map ignored these completely, drawing straight lines that conveniently cut off my most beautiful acre. I noticed small writing in the corner of Grandpa's deed that I'd never paid attention to before. It referenced county survey markers from 1952. If those markers still existed, a plan began forming in my mind. I'd need help, though. I scrolled through my phone contacts until I found James Jacobson, a surveyor who'd worked with my father years ago. I texted him, even though it was 3 a.m. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove to the county records office. My cousin Vince worked there and I needed access to the original surveys. These HOA people, Vince muttered as we dug through dusty files, they're getting bolder every year. Ah, here it is. The 1952 survey clearly showed my property extended beyond what even I had thought. The creek had moved after a flood in the 70s, but property lines didn't move with it. My phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. Asterisk community announcement. Groundbreaking for Pine Crest Resort begins Tuesday. Please clear any personal items from the designated area. Asterisk. Tuesday. That gave me 5 days. On my way home, I drove past the Morgan house. Workers were setting up an even bigger speaker system by their pool. Tyler waved cheerfully as I passed. That afternoon, Jacobson arrived with his equipment. Let's find those original markers, he said. If they're still there, the HOA has a big problem. We worked until sunset, careful to stay out of sight behind my shed. Under years of overgrown grass, Jacobson's metal detector found the first marker. His eyebrows shot up. According to this, your property extends another 50 feet that way, which includes part of the Morgan's new pool. We found 3 more markers before dark. Each confirmed what Grandpa's maps showed. My land was actually larger than what I'd been maintaining. There's more, Jacobson said quietly. See this ridge? The geological survey from the 50s notes it as a potential archaeological site. Native American artifacts were found here in the 40s. I remembered Grandpa's stories about arrowheads and pottery shards. I thought they were just tales. What does that mean legally? If confirmed, it could trigger a historical preservation review. No development allowed. That night, another party started next door. This time, I smiled as the music blared. Let them enjoy it while they could. Stay tuned for the full story of how David turned the tables on the HOA and why justice sometimes comes wrapped in the most unexpected packages. Don't forget to subscribe to Real HOA Drama for more jaw-dropping stories like this one. The envelope felt heavier than it should have as David Carter pulled it from his mailbox. The return address confirmed his dread. Ridge Community Association, with Eleanor Winter's signature neatly printed underneath. He tore it open, his fingers grazing the sharp edge of the letter inside. After review of community boundaries, he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. Your back acre has been reclassified as common property. His heart sank like a stone dropped into deep water. This wasn't just any piece of land. It was part of his family's legacy, passed down through 3 generations. It was where his grandfather had taught him to fish in the creek that wound lazily along the border, where his father built him a treehouse in the old oak tree that still stood proud near the fence line. And now, Eleanor Winter, perfect Eleanor Winter, with her manicured nails and perfectly coiffed hair, was telling him it no longer belonged to him. David crumpled the paper in one hand, his mind racing. How could they do this? He stormed across the yard toward Eleanor's house without thinking twice, the gravel crunching under his boots like angry whispers. Her front door opened before he could knock, revealing her standing there in designer workout gear, arms crossed over her chest. She didn't look surprised to see him. In fact, she looked almost bored. "Can I help you, David?" she asked, her tone clipped, her eyes flickering past him as if searching for something more interesting. "This letter says you're taking my land," David said, trying and failing to keep his voice steady. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, offering a smile so practiced it might as well have been painted on. "No mistake, David. Our professional survey shows your grandfather's maps were incorrect. The board voted unanimously last night." David's stomach churned at the smug certainty in her voice. Before he could respond, music exploded from next door, a pulsating bass line vibrating through the air. Tyler Bennett and Samantha Morgan, the new neighbors who seemed determined to make noise their primary contribution to the neighborhood, were hosting yet another party. Laughter spilled out of their backyard, punctuated by the clinking of glasses and the occasional shout. Eleanor's lips curved upward into what might have passed for genuine delight. "Oh, good. The Morgans are having a welcome party. You should come, David. It might help you adjust to the changes around here." Adjust? David clenched his fists, but forced himself to turn away. As he walked home, the music grew louder, relentless thump-thump-thump that reverberated in his chest. Through the wooden fence, he caught glimpses of Tyler and Samantha lounging by their brand-new pool, laughing with friends. A pool that sat suspiciously close to what he'd always believed was his property line. That night, sleep eluded him. The bass pounded until 1 a.m., mocking his frustration. He tried calling Tyler twice, but there was no answer. Finally, at 1:15, he marched over and knocked sharply on their door. Tyler answered, red-faced and holding a beer. "Hey man, party's over, yeah? Some of us work tomorrow." "It's almost 1:30, David said, struggling to keep his temper in check. "And speaking of Eleanor, did you know about this HOA plan for my back acre?" Tyler shifted uncomfortably, glancing back at Samantha, who hovered just inside the doorway. Their guilty expressions said everything. "They're not stealing it," Samantha interjected quickly, rolling her eyes. "They're reallocating it. The resort will have a lap pool, cabanas, even a cocktail bar. Everyone benefits, even you. Not everyone, David shot back, his jaw tightening. That's my property. Tyler shrugged, looking anywhere but at David. Your grandfather's maps were wrong. End of story. As David trudged back to his house, the weight of their betrayal settled heavily on his shoulders. But beneath the anger, something else stirred, a spark of determination. They thought they could take what wasn't theirs, claim his family's history as their own. Well, they had no idea who they were dealing with. David Carter didn't lose easily. Not when it mattered. And this mattered more than anything. David sat in the dim attic, the musty smell of dust and aged wood lingering in the air. He hadn't been up here in years, but anger and a deep sense of injustice had driven him to search for answers. Inside an old wooden chest, yellow documents were stacked haphazardly. Tax bills from the 1970s, his grandfather's journal, faded family photos taken under the ancient oak tree. But then, something caught his eye. Tucked away in a corner was a tightly rolled map tied with a thin piece of rope. It was dated 1952, a time when property boundaries were marked not by arbitrary lines, but by natural landmarks, the winding creek, large boulders, towering trees. He carried the map downstairs, unrolling it carefully under the kitchen light. The hand-drawn lines stood out sharper than anything on Eleanor's modern survey. As David studied it, he realized that the boundary of his land extended much farther than what Eleanor claimed. It even included the area where Tyler and Samantha had built their new pool just months earlier. For a moment, he felt as if he'd uncovered a hidden treasure, though it also pulled him into a game he never wanted to play. But the map alone wasn't enough. He needed someone who could verify its accuracy. Immediately, David thought of James Robertson, a calm, middle-aged man his father used to work with. James knew this area like the back of his hand. Without hesitation, David flipped through an old phone book and dialed James' number. Despite the clock nearing 3 a.m., James? I hope I'm not bothering you, but I need your help, David said, urgency threading his voice. James listened patiently and promised to come first thing in the morning. True to his word, he arrived at dawn with a small truck loaded with surveying equipment. All right, son, James said, his tone steady yet decisive. Let's see if those markers still exist. They started near the old oak tree, one of the key boundary points according to the map. Beneath layers of overgrown grass, James' metal detector buzzed loudly. Bingo, he exclaimed, pulling out a rusted iron rod etched with 1952. They continued searching, uncovering 3 more markers. Each confirmed what the map showed. David's land stretched far beyond what Eleanor Winter had asserted. James looked at David, his expression serious, but tinged with excitement. If these markers are still valid, legally speaking, your property lines remain intact, even though the creek shifted after the flood of '78. David felt as though a weight had lifted off his shoulders, but he knew the fight was only beginning. Eleanor wasn't someone who gave up easily. Still, he now held undeniable proof. The challenge was figuring out how to use it wisely. As James drove away, David stood there, gazing toward his backyard. Morning sunlight bathed the field in soft golden hues. He smiled faintly, determination gleaming in his eyes. Eleanor Winter had made a grave mistake underestimating David Carter, and soon she would pay dearly for her arrogance. David stood next to James Robertson under the fading afternoon sun, holding a small piece of pottery they had just unearthed near the base of the ancient oak tree. Its surface was rough and caked with dirt, but the intricate carvings on it were as clear as if they had been made yesterday. This isn't modern, James said, his voice dropping with barely contained excitement. These engravings, they're pre-Columbian. A shiver ran down David's spine. His grandfather used to tell him stories about finding arrowheads and pottery shards when he was younger, but back then, David had dismissed them as tall tales meant to entertain a curious boy. Now, standing there with tangible proof in his hands, those stories felt more real than ever. These artifacts weren't just relics of family history, they were evidence of something far greater, the land's deep-rooted significance. Carefully, They continued digging, uncovering more pottery fragments and a sharp stone arrowhead that fit snugly into David's palm. He held it up, the fading sunlight glinting off its polished surface. "James, do you think these are enough to trigger a historical preservation process?" David asked, his voice tinged with hope but also laced with worry. James nodded solemnly, his eyes serious. If confirmed, not only this area but the entire surrounding land could be protected. No one will be able to build anything here if it's declared a heritage site. Without wasting another moment, David called Maria Thompson, the director of the local museum. He'd heard his mother mention her before, a woman deeply committed to preserving local history, always ready to lend a hand when the community needed help. When Maria answered, David explained the situation quickly. "I think I've found some ancient artifacts on my family's property," he said, trying to keep his tone steady. "They might date back hundreds of years, to indigenous settlements." There was a pause on the other end, followed by Maria's enthusiastic response. "Can you bring them to the museum right now? I'd like to examine them more closely." 2 hours later, David and James walked into the small exhibit room at the museum, where Maria was waiting with a magnifying glass and a notebook. She placed each item carefully on the table, brushing away the dirt and scrutinizing every detail. "These arrowheads," she said, pointing to the one David still held, "are extremely rare. They belong to a tribe that lived here long before European settlers arrived." Her eyes lit up as she examined the pottery shards. "And these patterns, they match artifacts found at archaeological sites a few miles from here. If I'm not mistaken, your land might have been part of an ancient settlement." David's heart raced. This wasn't just about protecting his land from Eleanor anymore. It was about honoring its history. "Maria, what do we need to do next to initiate the historical preservation process?" he asked. Maria smiled warmly, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "First, I'll draft an official report to send to the County Historical Preservation Committee. Then, we'll need to gather more evidence. If everything goes smoothly, this entire area could be protected, not just from the resort project, but from any future development." As David drove home, a strange sense of pride settled over him. This land wasn't just personal property anymore. It was a piece of history, a priceless treasure that deserved to be preserved. But even as he basked in the discovery, he knew the fight wasn't over. Eleanor Winter wasn't the type to give up easily. Still, now he had a stronger weapon than ever, one rooted not just in law, but in history and culture. As he stepped into his yard, the glare of lights from his neighbors' houses reminded him that his opponents were still watching. But David smiled. They could have power and money, but they couldn't buy the truth or history. Once inside, David sat down at his laptop and began drafting an email to submit a preliminary report to the Historical Preservation Committee. With every keystroke, a sense of quiet satisfaction washed over him. Eleanor had made the biggest mistake of her life, underestimating David Carter. And now, she would pay dearly for her arrogance. David sat in the dim glow of his kitchen, the soft light from the desk lamp casting long shadows over the old documents he had just uncovered. It felt like the tide was finally turning in his favor. The evidence was stacking up, undeniable and clear. But just as he began to feel a flicker of hope, his phone buzzed on the table, a text from an unfamiliar number. "David," Eleanor wrote, her tone still sickeningly sweet but laced with thinly veiled threats, "I hope we can resolve this soon. If you don't agree to hand over your land within a week, I'll have no choice but to file a lawsuit in higher court to expedite things." We both know how complicated that would make everything, don't we? David frowned, irritation prickling through him. A week? Did Eleanor really think she could strong-arm him into submission? He set the phone down, trying to refocus on the next steps of his plan. But before he could even gather his thoughts, the phone buzzed again. Another message. This time, it wasn't meant for him. "We can't wait a week," the text read. "Start construction tomorrow morning. Don't let David find out." David's eyes widened as he read the words over and over. This wasn't for him. It was a misdirected message, sent by Eleanor to someone else. His heart raced, anger and tension surging through him. They weren't planning to wait for the courts or give him time to respond. Eleanor and her crew were moving forward anyway, bulldozing ahead without regard for rules or laws. They wanted to seize the land before he could fight back. That night, sleep eluded David. Vivid images of machinery tearing apart the garden where his grandfather once taught him to fish haunted him. The thought of strangers trampling the sacred soil of his family's legacy churned in his mind. He stepped outside onto the porch, staring at Eleanor's house across the way. Her lights burned brightly, even though it was well past midnight. She was already preparing her endgame. The next morning, David woke earlier than usual. He called James Robertson, who had been helping him verify the property boundaries. "They're starting construction immediately," David said, his voice tense with urgency. "We need to mark the correct boundaries before they do anything irreversible." James arrived shortly after, hauling his surveying equipment. In the pale light of dawn, the two men worked silently, planting red flags along the original boundary lines they'd identified from the 1952 map. Each flag stood as a quiet declaration. This was David Carter's land, not Eleanor Winter's, not anyone else's. But Eleanor wasn't one to back down easily. By mid-morning, a team of workers showed up, dragging heavy machinery behind them. They began marking out spots for the pool and other amenities on what they claimed was communal property. David stood by the fence, watching their every move with sharp, calculating eyes. When Eleanor emerged from her car, her confident smirk plastered across her face, David approached her, clutching a stack of documents. "Eleanor," David said, his voice icy and firm, "you should know I've already sent all this evidence to the county assessor's office. If you proceed, I'll call the police for trespassing." Eleanor sneered, her eyes flashing with fury. "You must be joking. This is community land. I have the paperwork to prove it." "Is that so?" David shot back, holding up a copy of the original 1952 survey map. "Then how do you explain the boundary markers from 195? The dim light of dawn had barely touched David's backyard when the roar of a bulldozer engine shattered the morning calm. Eleanor and her team, faces set with determination, marched onto the area they claimed was community land. But David wasn't about to let them have their way so easily. He stood by the fence, gripping a thick stack of documents, his eyes sharp as a blade. "Stop right there," David shouted, his voice echoing through the cold morning air. The bulldozer screeched to a halt with a metallic groan, and the operator, a middle-aged man in a worn hard hat, peered down from the cabin, looking confused. Eleanor strode forward, her high heels sinking into the dew-soaked grass. She flashed a smug smile, clearly confident she held the upper hand. "David, I don't think this is the time to cause trouble," Eleanor said, her tone sweet but laced with thinly veiled threats. "We're just carrying out an approved plan." "A plan based on a forged map?" David shot back, his voice icy. He held up the stack of papers in his hand. "I have clear evidence that this boundary belongs to my family. The markers from 1952 are still intact, and they confirm that this land, including the pool Tyler and Samantha built, is entirely within my property rights." Eleanor's brow furrowed as she tried to maintain her composure, but a flicker of worry crossed her face. "Those are just old markers," she countered, her voice trembling slightly. "Modern laws don't recognize them." "That's true," came a familiar voice from behind them. Everyone turned to see Sheriff Davis, the local police officer, approaching with an authoritative demeanor. His gray uniform hat sat firmly on his head, and his piercing gaze exuded resolve. "I just received a call reporting illegal construction activity here," he said, scanning the group with hawk-like eyes. "Sir, this is all a misunderstanding," Eleanor stammered, trying to keep her tone light. "We have documentation proving this is community land." Sheriff Davis crossed his arms over his chest, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Oh, really? What about the permit for construction before 7 a.m.? According to county law, no one is allowed to start building in residential areas before the designated time. And I don't see any permits displayed here." Eleanor faltered, her confidence visibly crumbling. Tyler and Samantha stood beside her, looking like they wanted to disappear. One of the men in suits, likely Eleanor's lawyer, whispered something in her ear, but she shook her head, clearly panicking. "I'm ordering everyone to leave this area immediately," Sheriff Davis declared, his voice firm and unyielding. "And if I find any further construction activity taking place, I'll confiscate your equipment and issue heavy fines." A wave of relief washed over David as Eleanor and her team began retreating, their faces etched with defeat. Eleanor shot him a glare filled with resentment, but David only smiled, his eyes saying it all. She had walked straight into her own trap. As they left, Sheriff Davis turned to David and patted him lightly on the shoulder. "Son, I know your father always worried about people like Eleanor, but today, you've proven that you're not someone who can be pushed around." David nodded, feeling a sense of relief spread through his body. But he knew the battle wasn't over yet. Eleanor Winter wasn't the type to give up easily. Still, now he had another ally, and undeniable evidence. The first rays of sunlight finally broke through, casting a warm glow over the land. It was as if the dawn itself affirmed that justice would always find its way to those who were patient and smart. David sat in his small home office, the desk lamp casting a harsh light over the stack of documents he had gathered over the past several days. Numbers and lines blurred together in his mind as fatigue began to creep in. But then, something unusual caught his eye, a note buried in the public county records. Leaning forward, his eyes widened as he read the details. Eleanor Winter and her husband, Michael Winter, had formed an LLC named Ridgeline Development Partners just 3 months earlier. 2 weeks after that, the company had purchased the vacant lot adjacent to David's property. "This can't be real," David whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages. The lot they bought was right next to the area Eleanor was trying to seize for the luxury resort. If the project went through, the value of that land would skyrocket. Eleanor wasn't just aiming to turn this place into a high-end retreat. She was plotting to personally profit from the very plan she claimed was for the community. David stood up, pacing the room as his mind raced. Eleanor had always presented herself as someone working for the greater good, but now her true motives were glaringly obvious. She wasn't representing the community at all. She was representing her own wallet. He thought about Tyler and Samantha, the noisy neighbors who had always supported Eleanor. Did they know about this scheme? Or were they merely pawns in Eleanor's game? The next day, David noticed Tyler seemed more tense than usual. The once confident man with perfectly styled hair and expensive suits now looked like he hadn't slept in days. As David stepped outside to check the mail, Tyler approached him, his face twisted with worry. "Hey, David," Tyler called softly, glancing around nervously as if afraid someone might be listening. "What's going on?" David asked, his tone cold but curious. Tyler hesitated for a moment before pulling an envelope from his coat pocket. "I just got my new tax bill," he said, handing it to David. "What the hell is happening? Why did my taxes double?" David took the bill, his eyes quickly scanning the numbers. It wasn't just Tyler and Samantha. Other neighbors were complaining too. Eleanor had convinced the HOA board to push through a series of changes, including reevaluating property values based on the development potential of the area. This meant that if the resort project was approved, everyone would have to pay higher taxes unless they sold their land to Eleanor's company. "This isn't a coincidence," David said, handing the bill back to Tyler. "Eleanor's playing a bigger game than we thought." Tyler scratched his head, confusion written all over his face. "What do you mean?" David sighed, deciding to reveal part of the truth. She and her husband bought the lot next door a few months ago. If this project goes through, the value of that land will skyrocket. He paused, watching Tyler's reaction. Tyler's eyes widened, anger slowly rising in his expression. "She never mentioned any of this," Tyler muttered, his voice laced with outrage. "Samantha, and I thought she was helping the community." "But she's only helping herself," David cut in, his tone bitter. "And now, she's using everyone else as pawns to achieve her goals." Tyler stood there silently for a moment. Then he looked up, determination flashing in his eyes. "What can we do to stop her?" David smiled, feeling victory inch closer. Eleanor had made the biggest mistake of her life, underestimating the very people she saw as mere pawns. Now, those pawns were beginning to doubt and turn against her. The battle wasn't over yet, but the balance of power was shifting toward David. He returned to his desk and pulled out a thick stack of documents. "We're going to expose everything she's done," David said firmly. "And this time, she won't be able to run away." Tyler nodded, his eyes filled with resolve. They shook hands, and David felt a surge of energy course through him. Eleanor Winter had played her game for far too long. Now it was his turn to teach her a lesson about fairness and honesty. David stood before the double doors of the Ridge Community Center, feeling as though every eye in the neighborhood was fixed on him. The emergency HOA meeting had started 20 minutes early, a tactic Eleanor often used to exclude those who might oppose her. But this time, David was prepared. He entered the room carrying a sleek black briefcase, its contents meticulously gathered over countless sleepless nights with James Jacobson's help. The room was packed, with over 100 neighbors squeezed onto metal folding chairs. Familiar faces from years past watched him curiously, while newer residents exchanged skeptical glances. Eleanor stood at the podium, her crimson blazer perfectly matched with her lipstick, her voice clear and confident as it rang through the room. "As I was saying before being interrupted, before anyone casts a vote," David interrupted, his voice loud and steady, "you should know exactly what you're voting for." Eleanor turned, her eyes flashing with anger. "Mr. Jackson, you're out of order," she snapped, enunciating each word sharply. But David didn't flinch. He strode down the center aisle, his voice echoing through the crowded room. "Funny you mention rules. Let's talk about how you've broken them." He opened his briefcase and pulled out 3 large maps, spreading them across the presentation table to the rapt attention of the audience. "This first document," he explained, pointing to the winding blue line of the creek on the 1952 survey, shows property boundaries based on natural landmarks. After the flood of '78, the creek changed course. But according to state law, property lines remain unchanged regardless of natural shifts. However, the new survey you provided completely ignores this." Murmurs rippled through the room as David pressed on. He displayed the certified survey prepared by James Jacobson, its red boundary lines extending far beyond what the HOA had claimed. "Under state law and county records," David said firmly, "this entire area, including the land where Tyler and Samantha built their pool and where Eleanor added onto her house, belongs to me." A sharp intake of breath sounded from the front row. Tyler Morgan shot up, his face pale. "This can't be happening," he stammered. But David wasn't finished. He presented emails and documents detailing the LLC Eleanor and her husband had created. 3 months ago," David continued, raising his voice, "Eleanor and her husband formed a company called Ridgeline Development Partners. 2 weeks later, that company purchased the vacant lot next door, a lot whose value will skyrocket if the resort project is approved." The room fell silent for a moment before erupting into chatter. Several board members nervously glanced at Eleanor, who now looked as though she'd swallowed a lemon. Diana Chun, a fair-minded member of the board, stood up. "I move to adjourn this meeting and suspend all actions related to the development project until there's a full investigation into these allegations." "This is unacceptable," Eleanor shouted, her voice trembling. But no one was listening to her anymore. Neighbors began questioning her, and even some board members turned their backs. Rose, the elderly neighbor, rose from her seat, her voice strong and unwavering. "I was here when they tried the same trick with the Henderson family in 1989. Eleanor thought she could pull the same stunt, but this time, she's wrong." Finally, the vote took place. By an overwhelming majority, Eleanor was removed from her position as HOA president, and the resort construction plans were indefinitely suspended. As Eleanor stormed out of the room, her face ghostly pale with rage, David felt a deep sense of relief wash over him. But he knew this wasn't the end. Though the victory was sweet, Eleanor Winter wasn't someone who gave up easily. The war may have quieted for now, but it wasn't over. Not yet. After the long, tense night at the HOA meeting, Eleanor Winter became a shadow of her former self. The schemes and manipulations she had kept hidden were now exposed to the entire community, an indelible stain on her reputation. At first, Eleanor tried to maintain her composure, but the neighbors' hostile glares and prolonged silence slowly made her realize that the power and influence she once held had completely collapsed. One morning, as David sat drinking coffee on his porch, he noticed a bright red "For Sale" sign planted in Eleanor's front yard. It stood out starkly against the perfectly manicured lawn, a clear declaration. Eleanor was leaving. In the days that followed, news of Eleanor's decision to sell her house spread throughout the neighborhood. It turned out that not only had her reputation been ruined, but her personal finances were also in shambles. When the new tax assessments were made public, the value of Eleanor's property plummeted due to the illegal renovations she had carried out on the encroached land. The bank refused to extend her loan, and mounting financial pressure ultimately forced Eleanor to seek a new home. Neighbors began speculating that Eleanor and her husband would move to a smaller town where their names hadn't yet been tarnished by scandal. But for David and the Ridge community, Eleanor was now nothing more than a bitter memory. Meanwhile, Tyler and Samantha Morgan, once staunch supporters of Eleanor and active participants in her plans, began their journey toward redemption. One afternoon, as David was repairing the fence at the back of his property, he heard soft footsteps approaching. It was Tyler, his face etched with remorse. "David, can we talk for a moment?" Tyler asked, his tone markedly different from his usual arrogance. David stopped what he was doing, studied Tyler for a moment, then nodded. Tyler sighed, his eyes cast downward. "I know we were wrong," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "We thought the resort project would benefit everyone. But then we realized Eleanor was just using us." Samantha appeared behind her husband, her eyes filled with guilt. "We had no idea she was capable of such things," Samantha added. "And when we tried to back out, she just laughed and said we were acceptable collateral damage." David looked at the two of them, his initial anger gradually giving way to empathy. He understood that Tyler and Samantha were also victims in Eleanor's game of power. "I appreciate your honesty," David said, his voice softer now. "But remember, trust takes time to rebuild." Tyler and Samantha nodded, determined to change their ways. From that point on, they began mending their relationships with David and the other neighbors. They stopped hosting loud parties and instead started participating in community activities, even helping elderly neighbors like Rose Anderson. Slowly but surely, Tyler and Samantha transformed from troublemakers into close friends of David. They even helped him clean up the backyard garden, which had been damaged by Eleanor's machinery. One evening, as the group gathered on David's porch, the atmosphere was completely different from the tension-filled months prior. Warm yellow lights illuminated the space, blending with laughter and the comforting aroma of cookies Rose had brought over. Tyler raised his glass of lemonade, his expression sincere. "Thank you for giving us a chance to make amends, David," he said. "We've learned a valuable lesson." David smiled, his gaze drifting toward the backyard, where the stream still flowed gently as it had for hundreds of years. "Sometimes," he said softly, "we all make mistakes. What matters is how we fix them." Eleanor's story had come to an end, but the story of the Ridge community was just beginning. With unity and trust, they had turned a tense battle into an opportunity to build a better living environment. And for David, this victory wasn't just about protecting his family's land. It was proof of the strength of patience, wisdom, and love for one's homeland. 2 weeks after the dramatic events at the HOA meeting, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted dramatically. Eleanor Winter had all but disappeared from public view. Her "For Sale" sign still stood tall in front of her house, and rumors of her departure grew louder by the day. But David Carter no longer had time to dwell on Eleanor. Now he had a greater responsibility to protect the community he cherished. One afternoon, as warm golden sunlight bathed the backyard garden, Rose appeared at David's front door, holding a bottle of champagne and an official-looking document. Her eyes sparkled with pride as she smiled. "I have good news," she said, handing the document to David. He opened it and saw his name boldly printed at the top. "David Carter, chairman of the Architectural Review Committee and Property Rights Committee. This was a unanimous decision by the board, Rose announced, her voice brimming with excitement. Not only that, but they've approved the funding you proposed. All property boundaries in the area will be re-verified, and the entire cost will be covered by the HOA. David felt a surge of positive energy run through him. This wasn't just a personal victory, it was a triumph for the entire community. Conflicts like the one he had faced would never happen again, at least not under his watch. He knew that taking on this role wasn't just an honor, but also a heavy responsibility. Still, he understood that if anyone could carry out this task fairly and transparently, it had to be him. Meanwhile, the historical preservation status of David's family land had officially been approved. Experts from the local university had completed their examination of the ancient artifacts discovered by Jacobson. The results astonished both David and the community. The stone arrowheads and pottery shards weren't just authentic, they were incredibly rare, belonging to an ancient indigenous culture that had lived in the area hundreds of years ago. David laughed aloud when he read Vince's text. The State Historical Society wants to discuss a preservation grant. He stepped out onto the porch, gazing at the land behind his house. It was no longer just his family's private property, it was now part of a historical legacy. No luxury pools, no high-end resorts, and certainly no profit-driven schemes could ever touch it. This land would be protected forever, not just for the current generation but for future ones as well. That evening, David and Rose sat on the porch, raising glasses of champagne to celebrate the victory. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and red, creating a scene so peaceful it was almost indescribable. Laughter and conversation drifted over from nearby neighbors, no longer the raucous parties of the past, but friendly exchanges between old and new residents. You know, Rose said, her gaze fixed on the winding creek in the distance. Mr. Henderson used to say that sometimes the best way to hold onto something isn't through strength, but through patience.
You did exactly that.
David smiled, his eyes thoughtful. His grandfather had taught him something similar. Sometimes people's greatest enemy isn't you, it's their own arrogance. Eleanor had fallen into her own trap, and now, David's family land was permanently safeguarded. I never wanted a fight, David admitted, his voice softening. I just wanted to reclaim what was rightfully mine. Rose nodded, her eyes full of empathy. But sometimes, a fight is necessary to protect what truly matters. And now, you're not just protecting your land, you're protecting this entire community. David looked toward the horizon, where the sun was slowly setting. Its final rays illuminated the family land, as if affirming that justice always finds those who are patient and wise. Eleanor Winter might have left, but the lesson from this story would remain. A reminder to anyone who tried to disrupt the community's balance for personal gain. As night began to fall, David felt a deep sense of peace. This land, the home of his grandfather, his father, and now himself, would continue to be protected, not just by laws but by love and loyalty to the past. And he knew that no matter what the future held, this land would always be the place he called home.